Riddle me this. A posh guy who paints and has no teeth because they fell out from syphilis because he went from brothel to brothel. And who, on top of that, has to ask his brother for money to live because he can't survive on his own. Does that sound like anyone you know? Hi, I'm Antonio García Villarán, and in this video I'm going to talk to you about Van Gogh. That's right, about Van Doler. And look, I'm going to say it, I like Van Gogh. It's true that I used to like him much more than I do now, but of course I always like to research the lives of artists. And I also think that demystification is something fundamental, because we can't think that an artist is God. First, you have to know that Van Gogh is the invention of a Japanese man. Yes. That thing about selling the sunflowers painting, which sold for $39.9 million, this was around 1987. And it was bought by some billionaire named Yasuo Godo. Well, it's common knowledge that this was a marketing strategy to make paintings by him and his group, and many other people and many people involved, increase in value. Of course, if I buy a painting by an author who isn't very highly valued yet, we know that Van Gogh in the 60s, and his relatives say this, still wasn't very well known. His paintings were still cheap, but of course, if I buy one of those paintings for a fortune, all the others go up. From the 80s on, Van Gogh starts to become known worldwide, and his work starts to have much more value. And all this because of some sunflowers. But the thing is, Van Gogh didn't just paint one sunflowers, he painted many sunflowers. As far as we know, he painted at least 10 sunflower paintings, which he also painted as decorative pieces. Let's look at it from this perspective, because they are paintings for decorating a house in Arles, the Yellow House, which was where he lived for a while painting, where Gauguin also went. Anyway, we'll talk about that later. Well, the famous, very famous painting, the one that was sold, is nothing more than one of these paintings from that series that also look very much alike. Some have 12 sunflowers, others have 14, but they're very similar. But anyway, one of them was chosen to be the winning horse. But come on, I think it has much more value. To me, the paintings of the sunflowers without a vase lying on the ground convey much more because they convey much more loneliness. It even tells me much more about Van Gogh's life. I always say that many of Van Gogh's paintings are self-portraits. Even if he's painting a sunflower, he's painting himself. But if you investigate a little more, you'll realize that actually, the person who started promoting Van Gogh's work was, curiously, a certain Johanna. Not Joan of Arc, eh? It's Johanna Van Gogh, that is, the wife of Van Gogh's brother, Theo. We all know that Theo Van Gogh dies 6 months after his brother, and of course he leaves the widow. Well, that's it. All of Van Gogh's paintings, the whole body of work. And it's this Johanna who takes charge of collecting all the correspondence, having it translated into several languages, and, distributing it around so that this painter becomes known. Theo's wife also holds Van Gogh exhibitions to try to sell paintings, and finally it's his son, Vincent Willem van Gogh, who finally in 1960 creates the Van Gogh Foundation, and in 1976 creates the Van Gogh Museum, the first Van Gogh Museum. And how does he create it? Well, with 200 paintings he had from his father's brother and with 400 drawings. If it weren't for a stroke of luck or the work of these people, we wouldn't know Van Gogh today. Because he's really not a painter. He's not the best of the Impressionists, as I said in a video. And some of you have said of the post-Impressionists. Well, this can be debated because, of course, if you look at the foundations of Impressionism, what do Impressionists do? One of the characteristics is that they paint outdoors, they paint landscapes, they work with light. And what does Van Gogh do? If not that, it's true that Van Gogh arrives a bit late to Impressionism. Besides, he only painted for 10 years, but Vincent was surrounded by all the Impressionists. He learned from them. And if you analyze his work well, he's not an expressionist, a Fauvist, no. He painted, what all the Impressionists painted. Another of the myths that is completely false. It was said that he didn't sell a single painting in his entire life. Let's see, that was said a long time ago. Later they said that, hey, he actually sold one painting. And he certainly did. He sold the Red Vineyard in one of the exhibitions he held. Because, Van Gogh exhibited? Of course he exhibited. Let's see. At the end of the 19th century, art was exhibited in shops. Galleries didn't exist, or there were very few galleries. And it's documented that in Tanguy's shop, where curiously painters like Gauguin, Cézanne, Seurat also exhibited, well, Van Gogh also exhibited there. But not only there. In 1889, before he died, he already exhibited at the Salon des Indépendants, Paris. And in 1890, he exhibited in Brussels with the group Les Vingt and exhibited again at the Salon des Indépendants, Paris. And as I say, he didn't just sell one painting. They've already found documents saying that he sold at least 3. And I'd say that remains to be seen too, because a person whose brother is a gallery owner, because, he was also an art dealer, well, look at that. Because, he was a bookseller as well as a pastor, and then he started painting. But before all that, he worked for a gallery where, by the way, his uncle got him the job, just as he did for his brother. His brother Theo worked in that gallery his entire life. It's also known that his brother Theo, for example, made a series of 20 lithographs of his work, The Potato Eaters. And he put them at a low price so they would sell. Well, they all sold. Look, what I mean is that when you dedicate yourself to painting, many of those paintings you paint, there are no documents saying that you've sold them, right? I mean, if you paint or know someone who paints, how many of the paintings you've sold, or how many of the paintings friends or acquaintances of yours have sold, have a paper, an invoice? Well, very few, right? And come on, with his brother being a gallery owner and him having been one, I mean, he knew how to sell paintings. Was he only going to sell 3? Let's wait a little while. You'll see. It turns out he sold many more. And the thing is, I think Van Gogh has done a lot of harm to young art lovers because, well, they've got it all wrong. I mean, you look at Van Gogh's biography and they say, to be an artist, you have to be a drunk. Because, of course, Van Gogh drank absinthe, just like Toulouse-Lautrec and many Impressionists. And they say, well, to be an artist, I have to drink a lot. No, you don't have to do that. Another thing Van Gogh did, which is why he lost his teeth to syphilis, of course, it's a sexually transmitted disease. He went to brothels, and that's a known fact. He went with Gauguin, and we don't know if he went with his brother too, because his brother also died of syphilis. It's known that Van Gogh lived for at least a year and a half with a prostitute, and I can just imagine him, right? Telling Theo, hey, send me money, I'm here with the... And on the other hand, which I also think is terrible, is that idea of, I'll dedicate my life to art. I'll just paint and let them support me. Let's see. Well, I don't think that's right either, because his brother Theo was also very smart. Indeed, he was constantly sending money to his brother, and one brother lived off the other. But let's not forget that Theo was a gallery owner. I think he was betting on his brother, just as he bet on Gauguin, for example. When Van Gogh had the idea to start an artist colony in Arles so everyone could go there and paint landscapes like an Impressionist group, which, by the way, no one joined, and they even struggled to get Gauguin to go. One of the excuses Gauguin gave was exactly that he had many unpaid bills, that he had many debts. And what did Biel do? He paid off Gauguin's debts. But there's also something Gauguin said about this. In a letter to Emile Bernard in 1888, he said, no matter how much he likes me, I don't think Theo will support me in the South just for my pretty face. With his cold Dutch character, he has studied the ground and is planning something. And he certainly was planning, it's just that he died first. Because, among other things, as you know, Theo was also Gauguin's art dealer. And of course, at the end of the 19th century, the Impressionists were in fashion. And curiously, Theo knew the best Impressionists, the ones who were in all the books today. And I'm not surprised he wanted to profit from. Another one of those false myths that he cut off his ear and took it to a prostitute for love and all that isn't true either. According to Gauguin's memoirs, he cut off his earlobe. That is, this little piece right here. And in the end, he says that same night because they had been fighting all day. And Gauguin says Van Gogh was chasing him with a razor all over the house because he wasn't right in the head. He had schizophrenia attacks and things like that. Well, at night, he goes to a brothel, another brothel, to take that earlobe to a prostitute. Later, other theories emerged saying no, it was actually Gauguin who cut off his earlobe because Gauguin was an expert in fencing. But anyway, all of this is also just nonsense. I mean, what does cutting off a piece of your ear, have to do with being a better artist? Another thing that does a lot of damage to art history. We'd have to look at his paintings, right? To know if he's good or bad. And by the way, that idea that he painted his best works because he was crazy isn't true either. He painted his best works despite having those attacks, because when he was hospitalized, he didn't paint. That's why I say it's done a lot of harm to young people, because many believed, well, I myself believed, that to be an artist, I had to do these things, or that the bohemian life was like that. And another of the false things that have been said a lot is that he committed suicide. Shot himself. And that, of course, that field with the black crows. Around there, not that either. Some researchers did an exhaustive study and concluded that two local youths who also really liked guns were playing with a pistol right near him and accidentally shot him. Since he knew them and to avoid placing the blame on them, he said he'd shot himself. But of course, 3 days later he died, which I don't think anyone expected either. And as I said at the beginning, he's not really that good of a painter. Well, there's a very good critique from one of his friends regarding his painting, The Potato Years. And boy, he tears the painting apart, telling him more or less that everything is wrong in the painting, the composition, the color, that things look like what they aren't. And we have to put it in context, right? At the end of the 19th century, the taste of the time was different. But if we compare him, for example, to Paul Sinnac, an Impressionist who also worked a lot with pointillism, we see that the analysis Sinnac has, not just of drawing, but also of color, is something Van Gogh lacks. Van Gogh doesn't reach that level, and of course, he doesn't reach Cézanne's level either. Cézanne's painting has much more quality, much more depth. He also deforms figures, but he doesn't make as many mistakes as Van Gogh, right? Despite all this, I still like Van Gogh, but I consider him to have been the worst of the whole group. Of course, you can't even compare Toulouse-Lautrec's mastery of drawing to how Van Gogh drew, which was very clumsy and crude, despite the fact that, and this really gets to me, everywhere says he was self-taught. Look, again, he wasn't self-taught. Van Gogh wasn't self-taught. Van Gogh studied drawing and perspective at the Brussels Academy of Fine Arts, and Van Gogh was constantly with his painter friends. And they enriched each other. Well, mostly they taught him because he started painting at 27, and he also never stopped visiting museums and learning there. Come on, please, let no one else say Van Gogh was self-taught, because he wasn't. And he wasn't that good of a painter. Look, his drawing wasn't that good, he didn't have that much color analysis. You only have to see, for example, a portrait, Corot's portrait of Agostina Fegatori, and the portrait Van Gogh also did, of the same lady, which, yes, is very expressive, but in the gaze, one eye is higher than the other, and so on. But look, the face is completely flat. It actually has drawing errors, which are later seen as something positive. Okay, but, well, he wasn't that good of a painter. Van Gogh. I think Van Gogh is so popular because he's a painter whose work seems easy to do. In a way, he's right. If you study a bit of color and do an expressionist drawing, it's easier to paint a picture that looks like a Van Gogh than to paint, for example, a picture that looks like a Manet. And, well, another thing said about Van Gogh is that he painted more than 900 paintings in just 10 years. Which, well, this plus the drawings, that's a lot, right? I honestly think that many of those paintings are fakes. Because, of course, the market needs Van Gogh paintings. And even more so when they've reached such astronomical prices. I have a whole theory about the art market, but, well, in another video. I'll tell you about it. Yay! Because this averages out to about 2 paintings per week. Some Van Gogh paintings are indeed complex to make. They have many brush strokes, they aren't done in a day. Besides, he wrote a ton of letters, he wrote them to Theo and other people, and, well, people used to write letters to communicate, to say what they felt. But come on, I think if Van Gogh were alive today, he'd definitely be a YouTuber. Despite all this, I'm telling you, I like Van Gogh. It's true that I used to feel more fascination for his work. And now less and less, because I like other artists much more. He's a painter, of course, who is very interesting, and, well, I hope this video simply serves to give you another view of Van Gogh. I hope you liked it. Share it, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell, and leave me a comment on what you thought of everything I've told you. So, I'll see you very soon. Hello? Oh? Don Carlos? No, you had the wrong number.